Good afternoon, class. This is John. Welcome back. I'm actually doing the same screencast this afternoon for both my classes, both my environmental history, American environmental history class, and my world civ class. And those of you who are in class, you got underway with this, and I'll just click steadily through the slides to refresh everyone as to what we're up to today and why we're up to it. And of course, today's lesson is brought to us um, in conjunction with the rather noteworthy announcement yesterday by the Trump administration, by President Trump, that the United States is planning on moving forward, withdrawing from the International Paris Agreement on climate change. So we played a little clip in class, about a minute or so, that showed President Trump announcing this decision. We talked a little bit about the basic details of the agreement and the framework that it represents, and of course the level of involvement of the United States and other developed and developing countries in this international effort that had a fair amount of momentum and had brought had created quite a bit of optimism, particularly among environmentalists and climatologists and other people with a basic interest in environmental health and well-being. So I spoke to that, and this expression here by the Natural Resource Defense Council, I think, embodies a lot of the hope and promise that many had attached and are attaching to this landmark agreement. So in class we talked about the key elements and discussed sort of the way in which the Paris Agreement was set up, and there are a number of red terms that emerge along with this. And I left off in class today essentially right around here. And so the framework of the Paris Climate Agreement is one that really, it's not binding in terms of the commitments that individual countries make toward actually reducing and decreasing their greenhouse gas emissions. But it does create a set of expectations as far as the process goes. It requires, the only thing binding about the Paris Agreement is that if you have signed on to this agreement, and as I've already mentioned in my earlier comments, every country in the world except for Syria and Nicaragua had signed on to the Paris Agreement. And now, as of yesterday, the United States has signaled its intention to withdraw from the agreement. Of course, it will take some time. I believe there's a 3-year delay, or I should say a 3-year lead time, whereby a country that has signed the Paris Agreement has to signal and allow for due process before they can formally be removed. But the process here is one of largely sharing the findings that a country has, particularly with regard to its inventories of greenhouse gas, sources of greenhouse gas emissions, so things like natural gas, coal, petroleum, wood burning, so on and so forth. It's not just CO2, although carbon dioxide is the leading greenhouse gas that is involved here. But every 2 years, signatory countries provide this data and this information to one another. And then on a 5-year basis, so this agreement was passed in 2015, in 2020 the countries will reconvene and they will discuss and evaluate how well each country has done in meeting its pledges to help bring about an overall improvement in global greenhouse gas emissions. Now you'll notice I'm saying an improvement, I'm not necessarily saying a reduction, because in some cases, for reasons that I discussed in class, among developing countries, some of them are using the notion of carbon intensity. And so a country can actually increase its overall emissions of greenhouse gases, while showing improvement in terms of the efficiency, meaning while they are emitting more overall emissions, they are doing so in a way that reflects an overall improvement or efficiency in terms of each unit of economic production. Okay, so they're doing it better. Their emissions are becoming better quality by virtue of being more efficient. I'm going to trust that that makes sense, although feel free to follow up with me if you're confused by that. Then the provision is that every 5 years, these countries will come together to revisit their progress. So essentially what's happening here is we have a changing paradigm or pattern or framework that creates sort of something of a positive peer pressure, that these countries will be evaluated on how well they live up to their pledges. They will be sharing information. Down here below, I talk about technical expert review. Technical expert review means that other people, other climatologists, other political figures and officials will have access to another country's inventories and reductions data, and they can review it to see how legitimate and how transparent that country is being. Also, this brings about a powerful source of domestic motivation. The publication of data surrounding inventories and reductions by a country also allows the people of their country to apply domestic pressure to effectively reduce that country's overall emissions. Now, all of this, I shouldn't say all of this, but much of this is being placed, or it's being formed around a consensus concern for this 2 degrees Celsius mark. And the concern here is that if average global temperatures are allowed to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial global average temperatures, that this will set off a string of sort of catastrophic climate phenomena. So for example, that would start to accelerate the melting of the global ice caps, and then there's these things called positive feedback loops. Since snow and frozen ice has a reflective quality that effectively reflects and limits, and thereby limits the amount of heat that is being absorbed by Earth. If you melt those polar ice caps, you reduce that reflective quality, and thereby you further accelerate the overall process of warming. That's a positive feedback loop. It's actually a negative thing, but it's referred to as a positive feedback loop because when something happens, it creates more of that same something happening. So this 2 degrees Celsius is a real concern, and this map here shows you the purported numbers of people who will be adversely affected and where by a 6-meter sea level rise, which is associated with an increase of 2 degrees Celsius warming. The Green Climate Fund is a provision of the Paris Climate Agreement, and it is a source of monies that have been pledged largely by developed countries to help developing countries come up with better strategies to convert their economies to a less carbon-intensive output. And so we have the countries that have by and large profited and contributed this industrial process, which has created and accelerated this notion of global climate change. These countries are going to be contributing monies through the form of loans and grants and maybe even business partnerships to help them adjust their efforts toward becoming more sustainable and having renewable energy sources. So a big part of the Paris Climate Agreement is that it is partly a process that creates transparency and accountability among the signing countries, but it also has provisions that help those developed countries provide assistance to bring developing countries on board with some of these improvements, all aimed at reducing the net increase of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so climate targets, this just gives you an example of the commitments that various countries have undertaken. The US has agreed to cut its emissions over 25%. Look at that, 26 to 28%, that is of 2005 levels by the year 2025. And you'll notice that these countries all have their different way. They have made pledges, but they're not all the same pledges, and they're to different degrees. But it's also opening those countries to be held accountable by other members of the Paris Climate Agreement to be making meaningful strides toward these pledges that they've put forth. China has agreed to increase increase renewables or non-fossil fuels to roughly 20% of its energy mix. That's greater than the United States. We're at about 15% right now. So China is aiming to surpass the United States in terms of how much of their overall energy portfolio is renewable. And then also decrease the carbon per unit of GDP. That's carbon intensity, as I referred to it before, meaning that for every so carbon per unit of gross domestic product, if they grow their gross domestic product by, say, 20%, they will not be growing their carbon output by 20%. There will be efficiency there such that for every increase in gross domestic product, their carbon footprint or their carbon emissions will be less than that 20%. That shows an increase in carbon intensity, and that is a good thing. It means they're getting more out of their carbon investment. Okay, that's of course 2005 levels. India will have an increase of non-fossil fuels to 40% of its energy mix, so that's pretty impressive. That's better than China. And then by the same token, they will have greater carbon intensity that will be 33 to 35% of their 2005 levels. So that's pretty significant. And then Mexico uses a different term. They use business as usual. So they're going to cut their emissions 25% of their business as usual by 2030. And I believe the baseline for that is the year 2015. So they're going to cut their 2030 overall carbon emissions such that they will be 25% below their 2015 levels. So that gives you a sense of how these climate targets work. And I will just close here by talking about the global order consequences here. China is looking, it would appear, to fill some of the void that the United States is creating by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. China is committed and interested in being something of a renewable energy leader and sees some of the benefits in terms of their economic development to build around this. Likewise, China has some work cut out in terms of improving its overall air quality. It's possible that with the money that China is investing and the partnerships that they are forming, and also the power of their example, there are many global leaders that are pleased with China's willingness to engage the global community on this important issue of climate change. Other world leaders' reactions, like particularly in Europe, news of the Trump announcement was did not it was not particularly favorable.